I first want to introduce you to our moderator. We are so very lucky and very happy to have her with us tonight. I have long admired her political skills and her media skills. As I've watched her for the past 5 years, she's been a host and a political commentator on MSNBC. I have to say, her intelligence, her voice, her skills in media just blow me away every time I watch her. And I just say to myself each time, my God, she's so good. So with that, let me tell you a little of official news about her. Karen Finney hosts Disrupt with Karen Finney, which airs weekends at 4 p.m. on MSNBC. It's her goal to shake things up and examine positive ways to disrupt today's status quo and change the way viewers innovate and create change. Prior to Disrupt, Finney was an MSNBC political analyst and guest host on the network. She has more than 20 years of experience in national politics. She's worked on 4 presidential campaigns in the Clinton White House, and she was Hillary Clinton's first New York Senate race. She was the first African-American spokeswoman for the Democratic National Committee. At the Democratic National Committee, Finney helped guide the party's communications strategy for the successful 2006 congressional elections and the 2008 presidential campaign. During the Clinton administration, Finney served as Deputy Press Secretary to then First Lady Hillary Rodham Clinton and as Deputy Director of Presidential Scheduling for President Bill Clinton. Finney currently serves on the board of NARAL Pro-Choice America and is a member of the National Association of Black Journalists. Please join me in welcoming Karen Finney. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm not going to sing. I just want you to know this panel we're not singing and dancing, but it's going to be really cool. I'll just promise you that, okay? How's everybody doing? Great. Well, I'm going to introduce you to our panelists, and they're going to come in one by one, and then we're going to have a really great discussion. Gonzalez is the Executive Director for El Diario-La Prensa, and she's coming. And Julie Burton, who you just met, she was for more than a decade on the front lines of the women's movement as the youngest CEO of a national pro-choice political action committee, Voters for Choice. So that's a little something about Julie. And our next panelist is a woman who is a pioneer in broadcast television, someone that I have looked up to for a very long time, Pat Mitchell. She is the CEO of the Paley Center for Media and formerly the first woman and president and CEO of PBS. Please welcome Pat Mitchell. Our next panelist, Aminatou, is one of the co-founders of the Women in Technology networking group Tech LadyMafia. And last but certainly not least, Kristin Gilger is Associate Dean at the Walter Cronkite School of Journalism and Mass Communication here at Arizona State University. All right, so we're going to start off, each woman is going to tell you a little bit about the report. And I want to just start with a little bit of an anecdote because it to me speaks to why doing these kinds of reports and this kind of information is so important. When I was at the Democratic National Committee, one of the things that we wanted to do was expand the voices and faces who were seen as experts in certain areas and the people who were on the Sunday morning talk shows in particular. And I can remember having many, many arguments with Sunday show producers when I tried to book the woman senator who was the chairman of a particular Foreign Service or Foreign Affairs committee over a man who was on the committee but who was not the chairman of the committee. And why? When I said, why would you not want the chair of the committee? She is as accomplished, knows as much, is the chairwoman. And they would say, yeah, but he's a little bit more popular. He's more of a name. And that's part of why this is so important. It's why women being represented at all levels of media is so important and why the information we're about to talk about tonight is so critical because we know we've made some progress, but we have so much more to do. So I'm going to start with you.
Okay, great. I just wanted to get a sense from the women in the audience, how many of you are planning to pursue a career in the media? Okay. Great, we need you. So when Jill Abramson was announced as the editor-in-chief of the New York Times, it was a huge milestone for women. She's the first woman to hold that position in the paper's 162-year history. Yet when you look at the overall status of women in the media, it's abundantly clear that we have many challenges before us. So for example, in 2012, women comprised 36% of newsroom staffs, and that may sound like a significant number, and it is, but when you look at this number and see that it has basically not budged since at least 1999, it again emphasizes that there's a lot of work to be done. And this is a study that was done by the American Society of Newspaper Editors, ASNE. For women of color, as was referenced before, the impact has been deeper. The number of women of color has continued to slide in newsrooms. And a survey last year done by ASNE, the same organization, looked at the staffing of 978 daily newspapers. This represents about 70% of US dailies. And what that survey found is that most women in newsrooms, 39%, are copy and layout editors and online producers. 37.8% are reporters and writers, which is the second largest share in the newsroom. So what's glaring is that we are not present as empowered, and I emphasize empowered, managing editors, editors-in-chief, content directors. And these are the decision makers. And really, this is a reflection of the values and commitment of news organizations, or the lack thereof. The report by the Women's Media Center also highlights women who are on the other side of the story, which is women who are quoted in stories. And who's quoted in a story or not matters not only for understanding the nuances of issues, but also it's how readers develop a sense of what an expert looks like. So during only January and February of last year, men were quoted 3.4 times more than women in page one stories in the New York Times. That's in 2 months. So women were quoted in 19%, only 19% of these stories. So who's quoted comes really down to the consciousness about diverse sources in newsrooms, and really one of the key resources that we have available to us are databases like SheSource, the training that comes out of the WMC through Progressive Women's Voices. And one of the things that I wanted to say is that, sometimes one of the issues is how women frame themselves as not being experts. So, be atrevida, be daring. If you think that you have an expertise in something, then don't pause to contact the newsroom and let them know that you're a credible resource. There's nothing, a good journalist is always going to value a good source. When I worked briefly at a .com known as Solo Ella during that whole .com bust, it was a bilingual site for Latinas, and one of the things that our editor used to tell us, she laid down a mandate. Don't come back with a story. A story must include a quote by a Latina expert. So if it was like a Latina you had to find a Latina who was an astronomer at night and a butcher during the day, you had to find her. And we would find, these women. It was amazing. So our presence needs to be increased not only in news stories, but also on op-ed pages. And op-ed pages, of course, are the pages that policymakers tend to read. The WMC report shows that editorial writers and columnists are still mostly, surprise, white and male, and the average age of columnists was 60. Out of the 143 columnists at the nation's three leading papers and 4 syndicators, only 38 were women. So again, what is fundamental are attitudes and the consciousness of news leaders. And when I was opinion page editor of El Diario before becoming editor-in-chief, one of the things that I would notice is that I would always get these midnight musings from men, and they would be epic, like Crime and Punishment long essays. And I was wondering, how do men find so much more time to send me these unsolicited columns? So and some, obviously some of them we would publish, but I started talking to women on the ground, women who are leading nonprofits, who are advocating for domestic workers, Bill of Rights for domestic workers, women who were doing all kinds of amazing work, who understood the nuances of issues and saying, you have to write, you have to be on this page. And I would get a lot of hemming and hawing, well, I'm not a writer, etc. Talk to people, just put those words on paper, and you understand what's going on, and your voice needs to be on our page. So, having these conversations and really encouraging women to step up and creating a space where they feel comfortable doing so is really key.
You described me in coming on the stage as a pioneer in the television business.
Yes, ma'am.
I did not arrive here in a covered wagon,
No, of course not.
but it was the dark ages. When I started in television, there were generally one or two women in each television station, and that only happened because the government of this country recognized that media was different from other businesses. Media had way too much influence, even then, in the early days of mass communications, had too much influence on the way we think and feel and the ideas and opinions that we share. So they incentivized television to hire women and minorities. And there we'd find ourselves in one or two of us. And as you may know, one woman can be a pest, two can be an alliance, and three can be a movement. So, so we began to move away from what we were told early on. And what we were told will sound familiar to some of you. Dress as much like men as possible. We wore those ugly things that look like ties. Lower your voice or you'll sound more like men, but here was the important part. Never, ever, ever do a woman's story. Because if you do, you'll get typecast into what was then in print, the women's pages. So what happened is here we were in television with all this influence, and we weren't using it to tell women's stories or to make a difference in the representation of women on television. That has begun to change, and the good news in this report is that now 40% of the working staff in television stations in this country are women. There still aren't enough in the clout positions. When you start to look at the decision makers across radio, television, and even digital, you do not find as many women in those positions of decision making as we still would very much need to see. And for me, a more important part that we look at in the report too is what difference are the decision makers making? Are we actually starting to tell the stories of women in ways that weren't being told before? Are we addressing the issue of representation and underrepresentation? So when you look at the fact that there are women leading, one or two leading news operations, there are women leading film studios, we should begin to see then a difference in the way in which women are represented. And in the film business, for example, you have actually seen a dramatic change. There were 535 of the top grossing films last year. Only 33 of those were made by Black directors, and of those, only 2 were Black women. So we know that when it comes to minority representation, both behind and in front of the cameras and in those lead director positions, we have a long way to go. But there's some good news as well emerging at the Sundance Film Festival this year. More than 50% of the films coming from the independent sector were directed by women. There's always been a larger number of women who were behind the cameras and making the decisions. Yes. There's always been a larger number of storytellers who gravitated toward the documentary format. But this year, there were more than half of the narrative films that were represented by women as well, or that were directed by women. So that, for me, is where we stand now. The numbers look somewhat better in radio, though they've actually declined in terms of the decision-making positions. But the numbers won't tell the full story. The full story of the underrepresentation and misrepresentation of women will change when we as media consumers demand that they change. And in particular on the misrepresentation, the stereotypes that still exist, particularly in entertainment media, around minorities, and I'm thinking in particular the statistic that showed up in the report, Karen, that struck me so, that when you look at the numbers of characters who are provocatively dressed, are in sexual and provocative roles, they're more likely than not Latina or Black American women. And we have a long way to go in terms of and if you look at the categories in which so many of these characters play, and just the very basic fact that 2 to 1, the lead roles are still going to men in film. So film and television and now digital content is so ubiquitous in our life, and it is the single most powerful influence in our lives. on everything from the way we look at each other, the way we dress, think, and relate to each other, to the way, in fact, we see ourselves. So we have a way to go, but the report shows we've made some progress.
All right, Amina, tell us about some of the progress.
You know, I was very excited to read this report for many reasons, because one being that for the first time technology takes a center role in this report, and I think is very, very important. So thank you to the Women's Media Center for that. One thing that the report does and shows, you know, is that women are the lead consumers of internet technology. That is completely undeniable. According to the Pew Research Center, women are outpacing men's use of both the internet and social media. This is very exciting for many, many reasons. And, you know, but also there are a lot of issues of misrepresentation as well in technology. So take Pinterest, for example, which a lot of you women in the room probably know, and a lot of the men in the room know because you have women in your life that you love. The truth is that Pinterest is a juggernaut in technology and leads more traffic referrals than YouTube, LinkedIn, and Google Plus combined. But for a long time, the media did not pay attention to them because it was seen as a woman's only platform. Well, guess what? They're making money, and women are leading the way there and on many, many other platforms. The same is true about mobile technology. There are more women who use their cell phones for purchasing and for decision making, which again, you know, just it always begs this question of if more than 50% of women are your users, why are you not catering to them? Why is money being left on the table? Why are they not being represented in the developer base of people who are building these products? Another really interesting example here is video games. How many of you women in the room are gamers? I love to hear that, you know, and a lot of people are really surprised to hear that exactly half of the people who buy and play video games in this country are women. And this mirrors the same problems that you see in media representations. There are not enough women characters being displayed. There are less than 12% of the people building video games are women. So, you know, there's no shock there. It's really no shock there why you have with the issues that we're seeing. One place, you know, where the report I think was very stark and apparent to me was when it is very obvious that women consume technology all across the board. Nobody is disputing that. But when you look at who is building technology and who is making technology, the reverse is true. There are less than 3% of the people in this country who are angel investors are women, for example. That is a disgraceful number, you know, to hear. And if you think about that from a top approach, who are the people that are putting in the money to make sure that platforms are being built, who have access? Again, it is no surprise that you see the numbers that you're seeing. At Tech LadyMafia, we always joke that this is an engineer's job to fix. You know, if your job is problem fixing, then the engineers need to get on top of why the user base is so heavily female and the developer base is not. Because what happens is that a lot of problems that are really apparent to your users get missed because nobody is catering to them. When you look at who is starting businesses, such as startups or any kind of media business, again, it's heavily dominated by men. More than 70 to 80% of all those businesses are started by men, and women have very little access. There are a lot of things that can be done about this. A lot of universities are looking specifically to why women don't think that they can fit into these roles. And the number one thing that they're hearing is that they just don't see themselves there. Mm-hmm. You know, and so the issue of representation, again, is back on the table in this issue of modeling. There are a lot of women who are building incredible, incredible things. And if you're consuming these products, you should be able to see yourself on the other side of them.
Okay, I admit it, I have a Pinterest account. But I'm actually going to talk just for a couple of minutes about women in sports. So the Status of Women report uses some data collected by Associated Press sports editors. And they surveyed 150 newspapers and websites across the country that provide sports news and found that 15% of their staffs are women. Now, as you go up the ladder, it gets worse. We've already heard 90% of sports editors across the country are men, and 90% are white. Based on this, a group by the name of the Institute for Diversity and Ethics in Sports has given these 150 news organizations an F across the board, every single hiring category, for their lack of progress in hiring women. I think what's really interesting is that it gets worse if you take ESPN and sporting news out of the equation. Of the 11 sports editors in this country, top sports editors, who are women, 8 of them work for ESPN or sporting news. If you look at sports columnists, there are 38 female sports columnists in this country, and 23 of them work for ESPN. So if those 2 news organizations came out, this report would look even worse than it does. I'm interested in this in particular and kind of volunteered to do the sports journalism, even though I'm really not a huge sports fan. I'll admit it. I'm interested in it because so many of our students at the Cronkite School are intensely interested in careers in sports journalism. And this actually sort of surprised us. So I talked to some of our students about why. I mean, they know what the numbers look like. They watch TV and see the roles that female sports journalists on television typically play. They read the sports columns and follow the sports website. So, you know, how do they think, why are they doing this? And the answer I got was interesting. I think it goes to the fact that in many ways our culture has changed. So these women, young women, either grew up in families that were real sports fanatic families, and they were part of that language and that culture and followed their teams, and it was part of their lives. And then also many of them, many more than when I was growing up, played sports. So one woman I talked to, she has 2 sisters who played Division I sports. So when she decided to become a female sports journalist, her family said, great, you know, fits right in with what everybody else is doing. So these young women are very confident, they're very well trained, they're skilled, they know sports, and I have no qualms about whether they can do these jobs. And there's actually a little bit of progress in this report even that women are kind of moving into some of the lower level positions, designers, copy editors, reporting, so I'm hoping that they'll keep moving up. But I think what this report revealed to me, the sort of surprising thing, is that it's not just going to be about their technical skills or their journalistic skills or their knowledge of sports. It's going to be about their leadership skills, which is what we're hearing tonight. And so I think that's something I'm taking back, and I hope it's something that we all take away.
Julie, I want to come back to you for a moment, because what strikes me in this report, and just I know from my own experience, when we're talking about women in sports and how that's changed, we're talking about women in whether it's digital media or television or print media, it feels like our cultural biases haven't actually caught up with the reality of, yeah, women are into sports and women are into gaming, and you know what, if you give a woman a shot, she can produce a really good film that'll make you a lot of money, and she can write a great column that can influence the conversation in our culture. And what it seems like, though, is, you know, we tend to think of these issues in terms of the biases, and we think about empowering girls and women, but also I think we need to impact boys and men, because I think we need to help boys and men see women in these roles so that the idea of women being in these roles is just normal.
I could not agree more, and I think it really also starts at the top. Those people who have the power to decide which stories will be told, who will be hired, they are the ones who should look at their own family tables and say, is everybody represented? Are we all in? We don't want just half the story, we want the whole story. Right. It's one of those reasons why I love this Verizon ad, a football girl. because we don't see women in the anchor box. And I love this little girl being an anchor, and why have we never had one? And why shouldn't we have a whole bunch? And it's the whole image is very empowering for everyone.
Yeah. You know, Pat, I want to ask you why, because we've seen reports like this before. I think we get why they're important. I think the information is important. But why, from your perspective, your pioneering perspective, why is it important to do reports like this? What do we need to be getting from these reports?
It is important, I think, Karen, to mark our progress and also to mark how far we still have to go. And sometimes just looking at the numbers reminds us. To your point about the images that men and boys are taking away from media, and to all the things that we know that result from the images that young girls and women take away, we know there is a price to pay. There is a social impact. We're not talking about other kinds of businesses. The media business is the single most powerful force in so much of what we think and do and act as a country and as individuals. So how can we just let that go? We have to look at it, and here's where I think reports make the most difference. They give us the evidence we need as media consumers. It's one thing if you are a student at the Cronkite School and you want a career in journalism, you can look at this and say, well, here are where the opportunities are, here's where I can make a difference. But let's talk about everybody who's with us tonight and watching this live stream. We're all consuming media.
Right.
And this report says to us, we should be making our voices heard because we have a long way to go. It's not good.
Right.
And we need to change the underrepresentation and the misrepresentation of men, boys, girls, all of us. You can't put any one group in a room. I don't care what gender, what ethnic background, what experience, and let them make the decisions for the rest of the world about how we're going to look, feel, act, talk, and what's possible for us. We can be what we can see, and we need to see the diversity that is represented in this country.
And Erica, isn't part of that about making sure, having women columnists and writers, part of it, I know from my own experiences, I get to decide what content goes on my show. Not everybody has that opportunity, but if you're the news editor, you get to decide what's news. And it strikes me that for women, this goes back to something Pat was talking about, do we as women get to not just tell women's stories, but tell stories from our perspective? Which is as a Latina woman talking about the war in Afghanistan, that might be very different than a young white male reporter just starting out. And I think that's valid because our country is so diverse.
Right, and if you're invested in audience growth, which is everyone it should be, then you have to have the right people who are engaging with your audience and understands its nuances. So if you're having a conversation, for example, around domestic violence, and the key issue with, let's say, for example, an undocumented woman coming forward to talk about issues of domestic reporting, it has to do with status, you have to have people who can speak to that conversation, how she may be labeled as a pariah just for simply speaking up about this crisis. So, authenticity, credibility, and the voices that reflect that authenticity have to be a part of the makeup of your platform. And I just wanted to tuck in a point before about visibility of women on different platforms. But when women are on these Sunday roundtables, which is very rare, unfortunately, still, or on these shows when Karen is on, crash the website, like send emails and send emails to say we want her back, we want to see her back, because that's how you realize your agency and our partner in this process to make sure that we can together elevate a platform for women.
Great. I know we need to wrap up, but I have a quick question that I want to pose to Amina and Kristin, and that is, because both of you sort of spoke to this, and that is there's an economic reason to do this. This isn't just a nice to do, right? Like, as Gloria was talking about earlier, we actually control economic power. We don't always use it, but certainly it sounds like, particularly in the gaming world, if some of these folks would wake up and realize who their customers really are, like you said, they're leaving money on the table. So from a business perspective, don't even just do it because it's the morally right thing to do. From a business perspective, it's the right thing to do.
You're absolutely right. I think that there's no doubt about that anymore. If women are your consumers, you should be catering to them. And we have a lot of power in the things that we choose to consume and the places that we choose to do it in. So just like Erica was saying, like, keep writing and keep making a stink and a fuss, because there are a lot of us who are behind the scenes who are trying to make it change. The other reason that this is important too is that when there are few women in positions of power, I guarantee you that there are fewer people of color in those places. And that's why it's so important to amplify women's voices, because this minority status that we have, it extends to more than just our gender. And there are a lot of perspectives that are being left. When it comes to these big tech companies, having women specifically in positions of power helps them to see what the future of the landscape looks like. This is what I tell everybody. If you want to know where the future of technology is going, you should ask women, because we have the answer.
Kristin, I'll let you have the final word. Pretty much if you want to know where the direction of everything's going, you should ask her. But go ahead, Kristin.
Well, looking at it from the point of view of a business perspective, if you're in the business of building audience, as you say, then you can't ignore any of the diverse communities that you serve. And so it's sort of smart, it is smart business to appeal to and include, and that means staffing and it means content, all the diverse elements of your community. So it's an argument as much for gender as it is for race and age and all kinds of demographic factors. But there's another thing at play here, which is from a journalistic perspective, it's just good journalism. Because if your job as a journalist is to tell the truth, to report fully, to reflect your community, you can't do that unless you are taking into account all of the diversity.
Great. Well, this has been a great conversation, and as always, I wish we had more time because there's so much more we could talk about. So I want to thank our panel as we transition to the next part of our program. Thanks to, let's give everybody a round of applause. Thanks so much.
And one last thing, you can read this report at womensmediacenter.com.